What if the person you held most dear was not merely family, but the other half of your very soul? What if nature erred, dividing one being into two bodies, condemning them to seek completion in the most forbidden way imaginable? In the Appalachian Mountains, where the mist lingers without end and the hollows keep secrets darker than the coal buried deep beneath them, there emerged twins who would defy every boundary of human connection. What if nature made a mistake, forcing one soul to live in two bodies before this record unfolds? We welcome you. If hidden family histories draw you in, and accounts that press against the limits of human nature intrigue you, mark this moment like a page in a ledger. Below, write the time and place from which you listen. And if the shadows here capture your interest, subscribe and remain with us. Now, let the story of a bloodline that perhaps should never have continued begin. Cedar Hollow, Kentucky, 1931. The most isolated valley in the Appalachian Mountains, where the road ended miles before the first cabin, and where the fog settled so thick at dawn that even sound seemed swallowed whole. It was here, in a log home built by hands already returned to dust, that Agnes Whitaker fought her final battle with life. With the storm winds, her cries rose and sank again into the earth, leaving Thomas Whitaker to grasp her fading hand while the midwife, Hattie Coleman, worked in vain. Before the sun had risen, Agnes' strength failed her. Her last breath trembled with words that were barely heard. Keep them together, Thomas. One soul. Promise me, the ruffian planks of the cabin floor were stained with her blood, a mark no scrubbing could ever truly erase. She was gone, leaving behind not one child, but two. The midwife, who in her 60 years had delivered more births than she cared to count, nearly dropped her instruments when she saw what had come into the world. A boy and a girl, yet alike in every detail. The same sharp nose, the same pale hair, the same gray eyes opening too soon, staring not at the midwife but through her, as if aware of something beyond her comprehension. Even the crescent-shaped birthmark, faint as a whisper, appeared upon the exact same place on their left shoulders. "Devil's mirrors," Hattie whispered, her hands trembling as she tried to clean them. In all her decades she had seen twins, but never this. Twins of opposite sex were not meant to be identical. The very sight of them unsettled her bones. In one palm, Thomas held his wife's lifeless hand, and with the other, he reached toward the cradle. His children, born at the price of Agnes's life, wailed as though they shared one throat. Hattie attempted to separate them into two baskets, but the moment their fingers were parted, their cries rose higher, their faces turning a dreadful shade of purple. Only when their hands touched again did silence fall, leaving a stillness that pressed upon the room like a weight. The coal miner, whose hands would forever bear the black dust of his trade no matter how he scrubbed, watched with hollow eyes. His wife was gone. Before him, his children lay like mirror images divided by flesh. He remembered her last plea. From his grief, the promise was wrung. Keep them together. And though he did not yet understand why, Thomas felt the truth of her words. These were not two infants, they were something else, something bound too closely for nature or even death to untangle. Outside, across Cedar Hollow, the fog thickened, sealing the cabin in its grip. Inside, Thomas named them Eliza and Elijah, biblical names for mountain children. But the neighbors would come to call them something else. The Whitaker twins. Nature's mistake. The children who belonged to one soul. In the first months after their birth, it became clear that Eliza and Elijah Whitaker did not live as two children, but as one divided presence. Instead of the innocent chaos of infancy, a perfect, unnerving symmetry was revealed. When Eliza stirred with hunger, it was Elijah who wailed first, his tiny fists trembling as if he had already tasted her emptiness. When a mosquito bit Elijah's arm, Eliza scratched the same spot upon her own skin, her infant fingers tracing a wound that did not exist. Their cries never rose apart, always joined, always aligned, until it was impossible to know which voice had begun and which had followed. Thomas tried to keep watch over them, though his grief bent his back as heavily as the coal shafts he worked. In the still hours of night, he would sit by the cradle with a lamp guttering low, staring at their faces, their gray eyes opening at once, blinking in rhythm, fixing him with the look of something ancient peering out from newborn flesh. As though pulled by a string no human hand could see, they turned their heads together. The hollows of the mountain are small places where stories travel farther than wagons and faster than the wind. Neighbors who came to offer condolences caught sight of the infants and left with an unease they could not name. They whispered of Whitaker blood running strange, of old tales about twins in the family who had been born too close. Some crossed themselves quietly when they spoke of it, calling the children devil's mirrors, a phrase that spread like smoke through Cedar Hollow. Hattie Coleman, the midwife, was heard telling others that she had never seen such a birth and prayed she never would again. "They ain't natural," she muttered, her voice carrying to ears that wanted neither proof nor detail. By winter, most avoided the cabin altogether, leaving Thomas alone with children who seemed less like offspring and more like two halves of a puzzle no one had asked to solve. As seasons turned, the pattern grew sharper. The twins reached for one another before they reached for food. Only when their hands were joined did they calm. When one slept, the other did too, their breathing rising and falling in identical measure, like bellows controlled by the same unseen worker. Their laughter, rare and soft, emerged in perfect harmony, so that it seemed to echo in a room too small for echoes. For Thomas, each sign was a reminder of Agnes' final words. Keep them together. One soul, asterisk. At first, he clung to the promise like a drowning man holds to driftwood. But as the months bled into years, dread began to overtake duty. What if she had not spoken a mother's plea, but a warning? What if she had known what they were and left him burdened with the charge of something the world was never meant to bear? Each morning, the fog of Cedar Hollow rolled heavy, concealing the cabin from the mountain road. Inside, Thomas sat by the fire, bottle in hand, watching his children breathe as one. And in that rhythm, steady and unnatural, he felt the stirrings of a curse older than his grief, older even than the mountains themselves. By the time Eliza and Elijah reached their 6th year, a language that belonged only to them they had already woven. It was not the half-formed babble of ordinary children, nor the playful invention of syllables that siblings sometimes share. This was something older, something structured, a sequence of tones and rhythms that flowed between them like water finding its level. Without hesitation, they spoke it, slipping between sound and silence, as if they carried a grammar etched into their very bones. To others, it was noise without sense. To them, it was a complete world. Worn down by whispers and by the watchful suspicion of Cedar Hollow's neighbors, Thomas Whitaker decided that school might grant his children separation. Perhaps among other boys and girls, they would learn to stand as individuals, to break the pattern that bound them. The schoolhouse stood 5 miles down the mountain, a single-room structure where 8 grades shared the same air and where one teacher, Miss Catherine Donnelly, ruled with steady patience. On their first day, Miss Donnelly tried what she thought was kindness. She placed the twins at opposite ends of the room, seating Eliza near the stove and Elijah by the window. She believed distance might give each space to grow, but within an hour she looked up from her chalkboard to see them together, side by side, their small hands folded neatly on their desks. No one had seen Elijah cross the room. When she asked how it had happened, both children lifted their heads in perfect unison and answered with the same words, "I was always here." The weeks that followed brought more unease. When called upon, they replied not as two voices, but as one, their pitch, tone, and timing indistinguishable. Their eyes, gray and storm-heavy, fixed upon their teacher with a steadiness that unsettled her, as if they already knew the questions before she spoke them. At recess, they did not join the others. Instead, they sat together in silence, their lips moving in that private tongue no one else could decipher. The incident that ended their schooling came one late autumn afternoon. Miss Donnelly had asked each student to write an essay describing what they wished to be when grown. She took special care to keep the twins apart, their desks angled so neither could glimpse the other's paper. She watched closely, certain there could be no trick. When she gathered the essays at day's end, her hands began to tremble. Eliza's and Elijah's work were not merely similar. They were identical. Precisely, each word, each turn of phrase matched. Even the flourishes of their handwriting, the curve of letters, the crossing of T's, and the dots above their eyes, were the same, as though guided by the same unseen hand. That evening, Miss Donnelly walked the mountain trail to the Whitaker cabin and placed the papers in Thomas's cold, stained hands. "This ain't possible," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "I watched them the whole time. It's like they share one mind." From that day forward, the twins did not return to school. Whatever hope Thomas had carried, that education might divide them, might draw boundaries where none had ever held, was gone. He saw now that learning would not free them. They were not two children struggling toward independence. They were one presence mirrored across two bodies, bound by a law deeper than anything a schoolhouse could teach or untangle. By the twins' 10th year, Thomas Whitaker had grown weary of raising them alone. With each passing season, the cabin in Cedar Hollow felt colder, and though his children worked in perfect tandem, he longed for order, for some scrap of normalcy that might erase the unease that haunted him. In the next hollow lived Constance Murphy, a widow with 3 children of her own and a reputation for practicality. She had buried a husband once already and managed a household with stern competence. To Thomas, she seemed a chance to rebuild what had been lost. Constance entered the Whitaker cabin with steady hands and sharp eyes. She scrubbed the floors, tended the fire, and brought with her a voice that cut through the silence Thomas had allowed to grow heavy in the house. For a time, he believed she might succeed where he had failed, teaching the twins to live as separate children instead of halves of the same shadow. But normalcy in Cedar Hollow was never meant to last. One moonless August night, Constance rose from her bed and made her way toward the outhouse. As she passed the twins' room, she paused. From behind the door came voices, soft but insistent. She leaned close and saw them through a narrow crack, sitting across from one another in the dark. Their hands were joined across the space between their beds, their faces pale in the absence of light. They were speaking not in English nor in the secret language they often used, but in something older, something that grated against her bones. The syllables rang hollow, heavy as stone, carrying a cadence that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. "The moon knows our names," the twins intoned together. "The mountain remembers when we were one." Constance pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a cry. She fled back to her bed, her heart hammering as if pursued by the very shadow she had glimpsed. By dawn, she had made her decision. Before leaving, she seized Thomas by his whiskey-stained shirt and hissed words meant as both warning and plea. "Those ain't children, Thomas. There's something else. Wearing children's faces. I've seen animals birthed wrong live longer than they should. But this is worse. You can't pretend it's natural." Her voice cracked with a fear that no discipline, no practicality could contain. By the time the sun reached its peak, she and her children were gone, vanishing down the mountain road without so much as a backward glance. That evening, Thomas found the twins at the kitchen table. Before him sat a breakfast already prepared, biscuits, eggs, and milk poured into cups, though none of them remembered the act of cooking. Their identical gray eyes lifted toward him, their voices rising together as one. "She was never meant to stay, Father. We are complete in ourselves." Their tone carried no malice, no childish spite, only certainty, as though the mountain itself had spoken through their mouths. Thomas sank into his chair, the room pressing close around him. For the first time, he realized Constance had not fled madness, but truth. The summer of 1945 came to Cedar Hollow with heat so heavy it made the air shimmer like water. By then Eliza and Elijah Whitaker were 14, tall, angular, their gray eyes sharper than ever, their movements still uncannily aligned. Neighbors who caught sight of them through the trees often whispered that they could not tell which twin they had seen, for their features had grown into near-perfect reflections of one another. It was in July that the first sign appeared. Eliza woke to find blood on her nightdress. The arrival of her first monthly flow. At the same hour, in the room beside hers, Elijah collapsed with a nosebleed so violent it stained 3 of his father's shirts before it slowed. The bleeding did not stop until Eliza's cramping eased. And when it did, both lay pale as limestone, their breaths rising and falling together in a shallow rhythm. 2 weeks later, the fever struck. Elijah faltered while drawing water from the well, his body burning so fiercely that Thomas could feel the heat without touching him. Within minutes, Eliza collapsed too, her skin searing with the same fire. Their father, already hollowed by whiskey and years of dread, faced a choice he was not fit to bear. Believing he could save at least one, he lifted Elijah onto the wagon and set off down the mountain, leaving Eliza behind in her bed. The mule strained under his command as he urged it toward the nearest town where a doctor might be found. But the farther they went, the worse Elijah grew. His eyes rolled back, his mouth foamed with blood, and his body convulsed with a violence that threatened to tear him apart. Thomas whipped the mule harder, fear and desperation twisting his face. But before they reached the valley road, he saw the truth. His son was dying. He turned the wagon back, the old animal stumbling as it carried them toward the cabin. When at last he burst through the doors, Elijah still convulsing in his arms, he found Eliza in the same state, her limbs rigid, her eyes vacant, her mouth spilling froth, as though she shared the seizure breath for breath. Thomas laid Elijah beside her, the two bodies trembling in perfect unison. And then, as suddenly as the storm of illness had come, the violence ceased. Their breathing steadied, their skin cooled, and their eyes opened at the same instant, locking upon their father with a calm that froze the air in his lungs. Together, their voices rose, not strained, not weak, but certain. "We cannot be separated." The sound was neither plea nor threat. It was fact, spoken with the authority of the mountain itself, undeniable and absolute. Thomas sank against the wall, sweat mixing with tears, his body shaking more than theirs had. He understood then that his attempts to divide them by will, by distance, even by survival, would always fail. The twins did not live as two. They endured as one, bound by a law older than his bloodline and stronger than his grief. The fever broke that night, but in its wake lingered a knowledge that could not be unlearned. Separation meant death. 3 days after the fever had nearly claimed them both, word of the Whitaker twins reached Dr. William Marsh, a young physician newly settled in the valley town beyond the mountain. Educated in Charleston and confident in modern medicine, he dismissed the whispers of mountain folk as superstition. Yet something in the urgency of the stories, the fever that broke only when the twins were reunited, the bleeding that mirrored across their bodies, drew him up the narrow trail to Cedar Hollow. He arrived at the Whitaker cabin in late summer, carrying a satchel of instruments and the calm assurance of a man who trusted science to answer every question. That assurance did not survive the hour. Dr. Marsh examined Eliza first, taking her small wrist between his fingers, her pulse beat steady beneath his touch. Yet, when he laid his stethoscope upon Elijah's chest, he heard the same rhythm, echoing with a precision no chance could allow. He shifted back and forth, measuring each in turn, every beat matched exactly, as though one heart pulsed across two bodies. The tests multiplied, each stranger than the last. When he pricked Elijah's finger with a pin, it was Eliza who flinched. When he asked Eliza to close her eyes and touch her nose, Elijah's hand lifted without command, tracing the same movement. Even when he directed one to open their mouth for inspection, the other mirrored the gesture, lips parting as if compelled by the same unseen nerve. "In all my studies," Dr. Marsh murmured, more to himself than to Thomas, "I have never encountered this. It is as if they share a nervous system, though they stand in separate forms." He tried again, testing reflexes, testing reaction to light, even to sound. Always, what touched one was felt by the other. By evening, his confidence had drained into silence. He closed his satchel with deliberate care, his face pale in the lamplight. To Thomas, he offered only a warning. The children should not be removed from the hollow. Their bond, unnatural though it was, might not survive the severing. He could not explain it, nor could he cure it. Before he left, he placed a small leather journal into Thomas's calloused hands. "Record what you see," he instructed. "One day someone may understand." The doctor never returned. In the weeks that followed, Thomas filled the pages with cold, blackened script. He wrote of mornings when the twins spoke in tongues no human ear should recognize, a language that seemed older than the mountain itself. He wrote of how animals grew restless in their presence, the hounds whining, the mules refusing to pass the cabin gate, the milk in the pail turning sour when the children stared too long. He wrote of their movements, no longer even pretending at independence. Eliza would rise to stoke the fire as Elijah already carried wood to the hearth. One reached for a spoon and the other held a bowl before it was asked. They moved like two limbs of the same body, a single organism rehearsing the motions of daily life. What began as notes of curiosity soon darkened into testimony of dread. Each page carried the weight of a father watching his children slip further from the world of men into something the valley had no name for. And in the margin of one entry, scrawled in a trembling hand, Thomas recorded what he feared most. Asterisk, they no longer act as brother and sister. They act as one, asterisk. By their 16th year, Eliza and Elijah no longer pretended at separateness. They moved through the cabin as though guided by a single will, two shadows cast by one unseen body. To Thomas Whitaker, the sight of it was unbearable. He had already buried a wife, watched neighbors turn away in fear, and endured the whispers of "devil's mirrors" that followed his children's name. Yet he believed stubbornly that there must be a way to break what bound them. His first attempt came in the spring of 1947, when the coal mines of Harlan County called for young men. Thomas arranged for Elijah to board with a mining family 3 counties away, far enough that the mountain's fog might not carry him back. On the morning of departure, Elijah stood calm by the wagon, his sister fixed upon him from the porch. "This will make you your own man," Thomas muttered, though his voice shook. Elijah climbed aboard without protest. But as the wagon creaked down the mountain road, Eliza did not move. She sat as still as carved stone, her eyes hollow, her breath shallow, as though each turn of the wheel carried her further into death. 3 days later, a telegram arrived. Elijah had collapsed within hours of entering the mine, seizing in the dust-choked shaft, blood pouring from his ears and nose. He was carried out barely breathing, his body convulsing with a violence no one could restrain. They sent him home at once. When the wagon returned to Cedar Hollow, Elijah stumbled into the yard half dead. And in that same moment, Eliza rose from her porch seat as though pulled upright by an invisible hand. Color returned to her face, breath filled her lungs, and when brother and sister clasped hands, both smiled with the relief of souls reunited. Thomas, shaken but unyielding, tried again the following autumn. This time he turned to his sister Margaret in Virginia, a stern woman who ran a boarding school for young ladies. She agreed to take Eliza, provided no mention was made of the children's peculiarities. Under cover of night, Thomas carried the girl to his wagon while Elijah slept. He drove through the darkness without pause, delivering her before dawn to Margaret's sharp care. The separation did not hold. Elijah woke with a scream that shattered the stillness of Cedar Hollow. He clawed at his own flesh, tearing bloody furrows into his arms and chest, his voice rising in tongues no human ear could decipher. His body shook with the force of a fit that seemed to come from another world. Meanwhile, miles away, Eliza sat in her aunt's parlor with eyes open and unseeing, her body stiffening into the posture of a waking coma. She did not eat, did not speak, did not respond. Her pulse thinned, her skin grayed, and within days Margaret telegraphed a single desperate line. "Come get your daughter before she dies." The reunion was terrible in its beauty. Carried back across the mountains, Eliza was placed beside her twin. Their hands found one another without guidance. Their breaths synchronized once more, and both began to weep, not with weakness, but with relief. Thomas turned his face away, knowing now what he had resisted for too long. His efforts had failed. The bond was not merely strong, it was absolute. They could not be separated. By the autumn of 1948, Thomas Whitaker had grown desperate enough to seek salvation beyond the reach of doctors or family. Word had spread of a traveling preacher named Reverend Joshua Mills, a man known across the mountain valleys for casting out spirits and breaking curses where medicine failed. Clad in a long black coat, his Bible worn from countless readings, he arrived at the Whitaker cabin with fire in his eyes and certainty in his step. Thomas met him at the door, his face hollowed by drink and sleeplessness. "They ain't natural," he whispered, voice cracking. "If the devil has hold of anyone, it's them." Reverend Mills gripped the man's shoulder and promised that the Lord's power would prevail where man's strength had broken. He stepped across the threshold as though entering a battlefield, prepared to confront what he believed to be evil. The twins were waiting, 17 years old now. They sat side by side in the main room, their gray eyes calm, their hands folded in perfect mirror. Neither spoke, but both watched the preacher with an expression that unsettled even his practiced resolve. The ritual began at dusk. Reverend Mills commanded them to kneel on opposite sides of the room, separating them by the breadth of the hearth. He sprinkled holy water across the floorboards, droplets hissing against the fire. Raising his Bible, he read from Scripture with a voice that rose louder with each verse, demanding that unclean spirits depart, that what was bound unnaturally be torn apart. At first, nothing stirred. Then, as the words climbed in pitch, the air shifted. A sudden chill swept through the cabin, so sharp that Thomas's breath plumed in white clouds before his face. The fire sank low, its warmth devoured by the cold pressing from the walls. The twins lifted their heads together, eyes fixed upon the preacher. Their movements were slow, deliberate, identical, as if one body guided two frames. When their lips parted, it was not to scream, nor to resist, but to smile. The same smile spread across both faces, uncanny in its precision, stretching into something too knowing, too calm for the moment. Reverend Mills faltered, his voice cracking against the silence that followed. The Scripture in his throat turned brittle, words failing as the air itself seemed to listen. The cabin walls groaned as though bearing witness to something older than his faith. The twins did not move. They did not speak. They only smiled in perfect unison, their gray eyes gleaming with an awareness that froze the preacher where he stood. The weight of it pressed upon him until his hands shook and the Bible slipped from his grip, thudding against the floorboards. In that moment, Reverend Mills fled. He stumbled out into the night, his black coat whipping in the mountain wind, his voice swallowed by fear. He did not return for his book. He did not return at all. Thomas remained behind, staring at the children who were no longer children, who now sat together with their hands clasped, the smile fading into something unreadable. His knees buckled beneath him, and he understood finally the futility of his struggle. He was not fighting sickness, nor misfortune, nor even sin. He was fighting something far older, something that could not be driven out, something beyond comprehension. The storm came sudden, as though the mountain itself had summoned it. On a September night in 1948, lightning split the black sky into burning veins, and the rain fell so heavy it turned the narrow paths of Cedar Hollow into rushing streams. The trees groaned under the weight of the wind, their branches snapping and scattering like brittle bones. In that chaos, Thomas Whitaker disappeared into the dark. Neighbors would later say he had been drinking, though whiskey had long been his only companion. Others whispered that the mountain had called him, that no man could live so long in the shadow of children like his and keep his footing forever. Whatever the cause, by morning his body was found at the base of Devil's Drop, a sheer cliff where the unwary and the drunk alike met their end. His neck was broken clean, his eyes left open to the weeping sky. The funeral was held 2 days later, a sparse affair in the small mountain cemetery. Only a handful of folk came, their faces drawn with pity for a man whose life had been hollowed by grief and fear. Yet their eyes strayed often to the twins, standing together at the head of the grave. 17 years old now. They looked less like mourners than sentinels, their expressions unreadable, their posture identical, as if choreographed by something unseen. When the preacher invited words for the dead, silence hung heavy. Then together Eliza and Elijah stepped forward. Their gray eyes swept the small gathering, and in one voice, neither male nor female, neither separate nor whole, they spoke. He tried to make us two when we were always one. Now he is free, and so are we. The mourners shifted uneasily, crossing themselves, whispering prayers into the storm-tossed air. No tears touched the twins' faces. No tremor broke their voices. They stood calm as stone, their words heavy as the earth that soon covered their father. When the grave was filled and the others departed, the twins lingered. Together they pressed their palms to the damp soil, and together they turned back toward the mountain, walking in perfect step. Not once did they look behind them. From that day forward, the Whitaker cabin was theirs alone. 17 was old enough by mountain standards to keep a household, though the neighbors scarcely acknowledged them. Stories spread of lights in the windows at impossible hours, of voices singing in strange harmonies that carried on the wind. Few dared approach, and those who did turned back quickly, unnerved by the sight of two figures moving with such perfect unity that it seemed less human than spectral. Cedar Hollow grew quieter still, the fog hanging heavier across its ridges. The cabin stood as both refuge and prison, sheltering the twins from the outside world and sheltering the outside world from them. Thomas Whitaker was gone, carried to his grave by storm and stone. What remained in his stead was more unsettling than his fears had ever imagined. Two children who were not two at all, but one. And now, with no father to fight their union, nothing stood between them and the full measure of their bond. By the spring of 1950, an unease had taken root in the Whitaker cabin that no storm could wash away. Eliza, just 17, began to wake each morning, sickened by waves of nausea. Her hands trembled, her appetite fled, and the bloom of youth seemed to drain from her face. Within weeks, her belly, once flat and girlish, swelled with a secret too heavy for her years. What defied explanation was not the pregnancy itself, but the shadow it cast across her brother. For every symptom Eliza bore, Elijah mirrored it. When her stomach clenched, he retched into the basin. When her breasts ached, he pressed at his own chest as though the same weight burdened him. At night, when she felt the first faint flutters of life within her womb, he doubled over with phantom spasms, his hands pressed against a stomach that held nothing but emptiness. No man had crossed their threshold since their father's burial. No visitor had come near the cabin long enough to account for what was happening. The truth hung between them unspoken, but undeniable. Whatever had taken root inside Eliza was part of the bond that had always joined them. They had lived as one mind across two bodies. Now they had conceived as one. It was Elijah who first pulled apart the cabin's floorboards, searching for something, anything that might explain the curse they lived beneath. In the hollow beneath their parents' marriage bed, they unearthed a small metal box, its hinges rusted, its papers yellowed with age. By lamplight, they studied the contents, fragments of family records, scraps of letters, and a brittle genealogical chart scrawled in fading ink. At the top of the tree were Jeremiah and Josephine Whitaker, born in 1778, noted as mirror twins who had wed in secret and produced children of their own. Beneath them, the pattern repeated. Generation after generation of twin siblings bound together not only by blood but by an unnatural union. Jesse and Judith, Samuel and Sarah. Names doubling upon names. The tree folding back on itself like a serpent devouring its tail. Among the papers lay a page written in their grandmother's careful script titled The Gemini Curse. The words spoke of a soul too large for one body, cleaved in two at birth, forever yearning to reunite. Each union birthed new twins, each marked with the same reflection, each destined to repeat the cycle. The curse, it said, would end only when the line failed, when no twins were born, or when separation was final and absolute. The twins sat in silence, the lamp flickering as the mountain night pressed against the windows. The papers lay scattered between them like pieces of a puzzle that had only one grim solution. Eliza's hand trembled on her swelling stomach. Elijah mirrored the gesture across his own abdomen. They did not need to speak what both already knew. The bloodline had never broken. It had coiled forward, unyielding, generation after generation. And now, with Eliza's womb quickening, the pattern had not ended. It had only grown stronger. There would be no escape. By midsummer, the cabin at Cedar Hollow had grown heavy with silence, broken only by Eliza's shallow breathing and Elijah's phantom groans. Her belly swelled with unnatural speed, pressing against her frail frame, while her brother mirrored every ache, every wave of nausea, every restless night. It was during one such night, when thunder rolled distant over the mountains and the oil lamp burned low, that a knock came upon the door. When Thomas had lived, no one would have dared disturb the Whitaker home. Yet standing in the threshold was Granny Morrison, a figure known across hollows and ridges, though no one could say where she lived or how long she had walked the earth. Her back was bent like a question mark, her skin folded into deep lines, her eyes clouded white with cataracts that seemed to see further than sight allowed. She carried no pack, only a small bundle clutched in her hand, and the air of one who had been expected. Without invitation, she settled herself by the fire, the old rocker creaking beneath her weight. "I knew your grandmother," she said, her voice a rasp like wind through dry leaves. "And her brother, too. They fought the same fight you're fighting now. Thought love between twins was a sin God would punish. But this," her pale eyes swept the room, "this ain't about God." The twins listened, motionless, their mirrored gray eyes reflecting the flame. Granny Morrison's tale wound backward through time. She spoke of the mountains before settlers, when a Cherokee medicine man fell in love with a woman forbidden to him. To remain together, they prayed to the spirits to make them one. The spirits granted their plea with a cruel humor, a single soul stretched across two bodies. From that union came children who carried the split within them. And each generation repeated the pattern, two halves seeking reunion, cursed or blessed to continue what could not be undone. "This ain't no curse," the old woman said, her voice cracking like old timber. "It's a cycle, a turning of the wheel. Every time the soul splits, it learns a little more how to hold itself together again. Stronger each generation, harder to part." She leaned forward, her breath carrying the scent of earth and herbs. "You can't stop it. You are it." Eliza pressed a trembling hand to her stomach, where life twisted and kicked with urgency. Elijah's hand mirrored hers across his own flat belly, his face pale but certain. Granny Morrison watched them both and nodded as though confirming a truth she had long known. From the bundle she carried, the old woman drew a small jar filled with white salve, the scent of roots and bitter leaves rising as she set it on the table. "When the pains start," she said, "rub this on your belly. It'll help the little ones come easier. They're eager already, too eager. They know what they're meant for." She rose then, as quietly as she had arrived, leaving behind only the creak of the rocker and the faint scent of her passing. The door closed, and the mountain wind carried her away into the mist. The twins sat in silence, the jar gleaming pale in the lamplight. Outside, the woods groaned with the weight of old secrets. Inside, they knew the truth as surely as Granny Morrison had spoken it. What grew within Eliza was not an end, but a continuation, a cycle that would not stop, because it was them. The winter of 1950 came to Cedar Hollow with a ferocity that old-timers would speak of for decades. Snow fell so thick it erased the shape of the land, burying paths and cabins until the world itself seemed swallowed in white. Wind screamed through the trees like the voices of the dead, and daylight dimmed to a gray twilight that never lifted. It was within this storm, cut off from all earthly help, that Eliza Whitaker's labor began. The first contraction struck at the kitchen table, doubling her forward with a cry that was not hers alone. Across the room, Elijah collapsed at the same instant, clutching his stomach, his face wet with sweat, though the room was freezing. Every spasm, every tightening of muscle in his sister's body rippled through him as if their nerves were strung on a single thread. Their cries rose together, one sound torn from two throats. They had prepared as best they could. The bed was laid with clean sheets boiled 3 times, water heated on the stove, the jar of Granny Morrison's white salve placed within reach. But no preparation could steady the horror of what followed. The contractions came swift, stacked one atop the other with unnatural speed. Elijah bent and writhed beside his sister, his body enacting a birth it could not perform, his breath coming in ragged gasps. As the storm raged outside, a sudden silence fell within. The howling wind that had battered the cabin without pause ceased altogether, as if the world itself had held its breath. Into that impossible quiet, the first child emerged. A girl, her skin flushed, her eyes already open, gray and knowing, too knowing. She did not cry. Instead, she turned her tiny head as though searching for something absent. "She needs her brother," Elijah gasped, his own body convulsing as though preparing to deliver the child himself. Moments later, the second infant came, as if he could not bear to leave his sister alone even for a breath. A boy, identical to her in every feature, down to the small crescent birthmark on the left shoulder. The moment his hand brushed hers, both newborns relaxed, their fingers interlaced with a precision that seemed deliberate, and they gazed upon each other with the calm relief of recognition. The silence broke. The wind returned with a long moan, pressing against the cabin walls, softer now, almost like a lullaby. Eliza lay back trembling, while Elijah collapsed beside her, his body emptied by a labor he had not endured yet had lived fully. Together they named the children Thomas and Agnes, for the parents they had lost. It was then they noticed what Granny Morrison had warned of. Their own faces had begun to change. Lines etched themselves where none had been. Gray threaded through their hair, and their hands trembled with sudden age. The life that had entered the world had not come freely. It had been taken from them, drawn out to feed the next turning of the cycle. The infants, meanwhile, lay in perfect peace, breathing in unison, their tiny fists still locked together. Eliza and Elijah watched, knowing with a cold certainty that the pattern had not ended. It had only grown stronger. The newborns, Thomas and Agnes, did not remain infants for long. Their growth unfolded at a pace that defied the measure of calendars, as though time itself bent differently around them. By 6 months, they stood on unsteady legs, walking in perfect harmony, their steps mirrored so precisely that it seemed a single will guided both. By 8 months they spoke, not the broken syllables of children, but clear words spoken in unison, voices layering into a harmony that unsettled even their parents. They did not call for Mama or Papa. Instead, their first words were to one another. "We remember." Everything in their world was shared. A bruise on Thomas's knee brought a wince from Agnes. When Agnes reached for a toy, Thomas's hand closed upon the same space, though it was not there. Their play resembled a ritual, movements timed with eerie precision, as if rehearsed in dreams. To outsiders, if any dared glimpse them through the fog, they appeared less as siblings and more as twin reflections caught in the same mirror. By their second year, their bodies were those of children twice their age. Their eyes, storm-gray like their parents', carried a weight that belonged not to youth, but to something older, something remembering. When they studied a page in the Bible, they did not need to speak, each passage read by one lived already in the mind of the other. They did not learn separately. They learned as one. It was in 1955 that strangers came. 2 black cars wound their way up the mountain road, their engines groaning against the ruts and stones. Men stepped out in pressed suits, their shoes sinking into the mud, their clipboards and pens ready. They had heard whispers from Cedar Hollow of peculiar children growing too fast, too perfect, and they had come under the seal of government investigation. But Cedar Hollow is not kind to intruders. As they advanced, a fog rose sudden and thick, rolling down the slopes like a living thing. It swallowed the trees, the paths, even the light. The men wandered for hours, their compasses spinning, their maps rendered useless. Each attempt to approach the Whitaker cabin turned them back to the very place they had started, their cars waiting cold and damp. At dusk, defeated and shaken, they departed, their reports marked unable to locate. The mountain had kept its own counsel. Inside the cabin, Eliza watched her children with equal parts dread and awe. Her body, ravaged by the accelerated aging that came with bearing them, now bent under the weight of years she had not yet lived. Her fingers, swollen and stiff with arthritis, clutched a pen that scratched unevenly across the pages of a journal Dr. Marsh had once left behind. Her writing trembled, but her purpose did not. She recorded the unnatural pace of growth, the way Thomas and Agnes spoke whole sentences in tandem, the way they moved with a grace that belonged to no ordinary human frame. She wrote of their memory, how they spoke of things they could not have known, places they had never been. "The children are us," she scrawled with shaking hand. "But more. Where Elijah and I struggled, they embrace. Where we feared, they accept. I fear and marvel at what they may yet become." The fire guttered low, the fog pressed tight against the cabin windows, and her pen scratched one final line before her strength gave out. The cycle is not breaking. It is quickening. By 1960, the cabin in Cedar Hollow had become a place where time did not move evenly. Inside, Thomas and Agnes, children by calendar, but already grown in stature and presence, moved with the confidence of a single consciousness stretched across two forms. Outside, their parents withered. Eliza's hair had thinned and silvered, her hands curled with arthritis that should have belonged to a woman thrice her age. Elijah's once strong frame bent beneath an invisible weight, his breath wheezing as though each day demanded more than his body could give. They were barely 30, yet their reflections in the warped glass of the cabin looked closer to 70. Every movement cost them. Every gesture shook. Their children's growth had been purchased with their own decline. Yet in that slow collapse, a revelation took root. What they had once believed a curse, an affliction whispered of in generations past, was something else. They saw it now in the way their children moved, in the seamless exchange of memory, in the calm certainty that radiated from them. This was not punishment. It was transformation. The Gemini curse was no curse at all, but a pattern of evolution shaping them towards something new. Eliza recorded the realization in her failing hand, her letters jagged and uneven.